The early 1980s are an interesting time in American movies, marking a transition from the boom of the New Hollywood era of the 1970s into a more commercialized era. This is evident just by comparing what the highest grossing movies in America were in the early to mid 70s versus what the highest grossing movies in America were in the early to mid 80s. Movies such as Paper Moon, American Graffiti, and Papillon were among the highest grossers in 1973, all of which would probably be marketed as art films now. But in 1973, these were the movies that had the widest appeal. By comparison, some of the highest grossing movies of 1983 were Return of the Jedi, Flashdance, and Trading Places. This is quite a stark difference. Despite this change, however, most of the prominent directors of the New Hollywood era continued to work well into the 1980s. Paper Moon and Trading Places make for an interesting comparison. Paper Moon's protagonists are two swindlers struggling to survive the Great Depression, and Trading Places' protagonist is a corporate ladder-climbing yuppie. This is emblematic of the shift that movies took in the early to mid-80s, the archetypal movie protagonist changing from the scrappy survivalist into the aspirational yuppie. Robert Altman's Ocean Styx serves as a fascinating case study in relation to this transition, as the movie was conceived and subsequently shot around this pivotal time. To understand the friction within the movie Ocean Styx, one must first understand that the teenager is a relatively modern invention. Prior to the mid-20th century, a social bridge between childhood and adulthood was narrow. It wasn't until the post-World War II economic boom of the 1940s and 50s that the teenager rose to prominence, essentially a byproduct of the American middle class with newfound leisure time and disposable income. Market researchers realized that youth was not just an age bracket, but a massive untapped demographic to which they could sell a lifestyle. The proto-teen movie was born with this desire to commodify. Early cinema often treated youth with a mix of slapstick and moral instruction. Buster Keaton's College from 1927 and Harold Lloyd's The Freshman from 1925 established the archetype of the awkward young man desperate to navigate social hierarchies. By the late 1930s, MGM had refined this into the Andy Hardy series, starring Mickey Rooney. These films presented the ideal American teenager, wholesome, girl-crazy but respectful, and always ending the day with a man-to-man talk with his father. Andy Hardy was the corporate blueprint for the good teenager that Altman would later take great pleasure in dismantling. The 1950s introduced a darker, more volatile version of the teen. Films like Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause, both released in 1955, capitalized on the juvenile delinquency moral panics. Movies like Rock Around the Clock from 1956 were the first to be marketed exclusively to teens, successfully using the new sound of rock and roll to drive a wedge between the generations. The early 1960s teen movies saw a retreat into the sanitized Technicolor world of the beach party movies. Starring Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon, these films presented youth as a consequence-free vacation, an endless summer of surfboards and chaste romance. While the real world was entering the free love era and the Vietnam War, these movies were a corporate-approved distraction. In the late 60s and early 70s, New Hollywood dismantled this artifice. Francis Ford Coppola's You're a Big Boy Now from 1966 signaled a new direction, using the coming-of-age template as a playground for frantic European-influenced stylistic experimentation. This lineage was refined in George Axelrod's Lord Lover Duck from 1966. A satire of high school culture that served as a direct spiritual ancestor to Altman's work. While the 1970s are primarily remembered for the auteur era of filmmakers such as Scorsese and Coppola, the decade was a pivotal laboratory for the teen movie, creating the two distinct paths that would eventually collide in O.C. and Stiggs: the nostalgic blockbuster and the exploitation film. Movies like George Lucas's American Graffiti from 1973 and Randall Kleiser's Grease from 1978 looked backwards to the 1950s and early 60s with a mix of reverence and commercial calculation. These were massive cultural engines that used nostalgia to sell soundtracks and a sanitized version of rebellion. American Graffiti in particular developed the hangout structure, a loose multi-character narrative of a single night that Altman would later subvert. While Lucas's teens were looking for their future in a neon-lit car cruise, Altman's O.C. and Stiggs were trapped in a 1980s present that offered no future at all. Simultaneously, the 1970s saw the rise of the unfiltered teen experience in films like Over the Edge from 1979. These films treated teenagers as a volatile, often dangerous class, scrappy survivalists who were products of economic stagflation and domestic breakdown. This era proved that there was a massive audience for meaner youth stories, a sentiment that the National Lampoon magazine capitalized on and that Altman leaned into with his casting and tone. It is also worth noting Altman's own Thieves Like Us from 1974. Though set in the 1930s, its protagonists share archetypal similarities with O.C. and Stiggs, the scrappy survivalists who are against the system and operate outside the law. In Thieves Like Us, we see Altman establishing an interest in youth as a tragic outsider class, a theme that he would later distort into a farce with O.C. and Stiggs. By the late 70s and early 80s, the scrappy survivalist was being forcibly replaced by the aspirational yuppie archetype. The 70s had prepared audiences for the nihilism and the R-rated language of the National Lampoon, but the 80s studio system, specifically MGM, wanted to pivot away from this gritty realism toward the safety of consumerist polish. O.C. and Stiggs remains a fascinating relic because it attempts to take the 1970s gritty survivalist attitude and drop it into the middle of a 1980s consumerist dream, or nightmare. To understand the tonal dissonance of O.C. and Stiggs, one must look at the source material. The characters were born in the pages of the National Lampoon magazine, specifically from the minds of the writers Ted Mann and Todd Carroll. They first appeared in 1981, eventually taking over an entire special issue in October of 1982, titled The Utterly Monstrous, Mind-Roasting Summer of O.C. and Stiggs. In their original literary form, O.C. and Stiggs were essentially sociopaths. The magazine stories were presented as a first-person dossier of delinquency, where the duo terrorized the Schwab family not out of a sense of justice, but out of a pure amoral contempt for bungling goofballs. There was no Gramps, no cancelled insurance, and no moral high ground. In the magazine, they were teenage monsters in the truest sense. Destructive forces of nature fueled by the boredom of Arizona suburbia. While the screenwriters Mann and Carroll themselves had probably already begun softening the characters for a studio audience, it was almost certainly Altman who decided to inject the film with its heavy political subtext. Altman was never interested in senseless cruelty. He was interested in systemic critique. By introducing the subplot of the grandfather's cancelled insurance, Altman fundamentally altered the DNA of the characters, turning their nihilism into a form of guerrilla class warfare. To ensure the audience understood who the true monster was, Altman colored the Schwab family with the darkest hues of 1980s bigotry. A pivotal scene occurs when Randall Schwab, played by Paul Dooley, returns home to find strangers in his house. His primary outrage is not just the intrusion, but specifically the presence of a black man inside his home. This blatant display of racism serves as a narrative pivot point, the Robin Hood shift. By making Randall Schwab a racist and an economic predator, Altman transformed the boy's pranks from random acts of sociopathy into a righteous, if chaotic, strike against the system. Altman essentially used the National Lampoon brand as a Trojan horse. He took a property known for its lowbrow humor and weaponized it to deliver a highbrow critique of Reagan-era values, racism, capitalist greed, and the erasure of the old guard. This, however, put the film in a commercial no man's land. By adding a soul and a political agenda to the characters, Altman made them fascinating as a directorial statement, but effectively unmarketable to the gross-out teen crowd who just wanted to see Porky's in Arizona. The story of the release of O.C. and Stiggs is a little complex. The movie shot during the summer of 1983 in Phoenix, Arizona, and post-production was completed by 1984. This completion date is confirmed by the fact that records from Denver Public Library indicate that the movie screened at the Denver International Film Festival in 1984 under the title The Utterly Monstrous, Mind-Roasting Summer of O.C. and Stiggs. This long-winded title may have been a self-referential joke, pointing to the movie's unmarketability. Maybe the highbrow, long-winded title was intended to be in contrast to the lowbrow nature of the movie. Or perhaps Altman just had a thing for incongruously long movie titles, as just a year previous to shooting O.C. and Stiggs, he had released the movie Come Back to the Five and Dime Jimmy Dean, Jimmy Dean, though this admittedly was based on an already prestigious stage play. Whatever the reason, MGM, the studio that ended up barely releasing O.C. and Stiggs, probably objected to such a long title. On IMDb, records state that the movie was screened for the MPAA in 1985. A specific date is not listed for this screening, though this does make sense, as 1985 is the year that the movie is listed as being copyrighted, as shown in the closing credits of the movie. The movie ultimately received an R rating from the MPAA. On Letterboxd, however, the movie is listed as being released in the United States on the 10th of July 1987. A specific state or city is not mentioned. The same date is also listed on IMDb. The 10th of July 1987 release is likely a regional test screening or a very limited qualifying run, a small test or token release in one or two theaters to fulfill contractual obligations or to gauge interest before moving it elsewhere. The major city openings in Los Angeles and New York didn't happen until months later. This is verified in Michael Wilmington's review in the Los Angeles Times on 10th of October 1987, the day after the movie opened in Los Angeles. Janet Maslin's New York Times review was published on the 18th of March 1988, which would suggest that it took an additional 5 or so months to make it to New York, presumably because it opened poorly in Los Angeles. This 5 or so month gap was not a common phenomenon at this time. If O.C. and Stiggs had been a hit, it most likely would have made it to New York and elsewhere within a month or so. This staggered 5-month journey across the country suggests a studio that was not so much releasing a film, but rather exhaling a long-held breath, finally disposing of a project that had been shot nearly half a decade earlier. Presumably, MGM hoped that they could at least break even on the money that was invested into the movie's production by dumping it in a handful of theaters. On face value, it's understandable why MGM would invest in such a project. Altman, while not having made any movies that were large commercial successes since the 1970s, still had a certain level of cachet associated with his name, and MGM probably figured that they could sell the movie just on Altman's name alone. The friction between Altman and MGM during post-production would suggest more than just a marketing dispute. While 1983's Trading Places allowed its characters to triumph within the capitalist system, O.C. and Stiggs were designed as unmarketable characters by 1980s standards. These are characters originally featured in the National Lampoon magazine, which was known for its bleak and nihilistic humor. O.C. and Stiggs were the scrappy survivalists of the 1970s dropped into the technicolor suburban nightmare of the 1980s, and Altman seemed determined to ensure that they never truly fit in with their cinematic peers. O.C. and Stiggs are abrasive and antagonistic characters, despite being technically protagonists, much like Hawkeye and Trapper John in Altman's MASH. They are the lovable rogues who are up against the system, as it were. The system in the case of MASH being the American war machine, and in the case of O.C. and Stiggs, Reaganism and general 1980s capitalist decadence. Reportedly, the only reason Altman got the job was because of his former talent agent, Freddie Fields, had just become president of MGM. Fields was an Altman fan and sold the board on the idea that Altman was ready to play ball and make a commercial hit. What resulted, at least to some extent, was Altman weaponizing the studio's own resources to create a parody of the very commercialism that they were trying to exploit. Peter Newman, the movie's producer, has noted that O.C. and Stiggs is one of the rare times Altman didn't, quote, hang around and fight. He was so unhappy with the process that he essentially left the film in the studio's own hands. Because Altman checked out, the studio's editors were the ones who largely shaped the version that sat on the shelf for years and was eventually released. This might explain why the film feels like a pull and push between Altman's signature style and a studio trying to force a standard teen comedy structure onto it. There are clear parallels between MASH and O.C. and Stiggs. In fact, O.C. and Stiggs feels at times almost like a teen counterpart to MASH, with Altman lampooning the teen movies of the 1980s with O.C. and Stiggs, much in the same way as he lampooned the Korean War in MASH. So it's understandable why adapting a National Lampoon story would seem appealing to Altman, as he could intersperse his anti-authoritarian politics into the narrative. Probably one of the best comparisons to be made here is Amy Heckerling's Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which is based on a book by Cameron Crowe, which, much like O.C. and Stiggs, is as much a commentary on the teen comedies of the time as it is a teen movie itself. The Spicoli character from Fast Times fulfills the same anti-authoritarian high schooler archetype as the O.C. and Stiggs characters. An interview with Altman on the DVD of O.C. and Stiggs confirms that the movie is in fact a send-up of the onslaught of teen comedies that were being released at the time. It was a satire of teen sex comedies, gosh darn it, not an example of that dubious breed, Altman states. Altman also admits in this interview to friction between him and the screenwriters, which is something that Altman was sort of notorious for, his encouragement of actors to improvise, often abandoning the instructions of the script. Perhaps one of the most poignant elements of the film is the character of O.C.'s grandfather, played by Ray Walston. He is a man whose contributions have been rendered irrelevant by the cold machinery of the modern era, specifically the Schwab family's insurance company. In this light, Gramps functions as a clear analogue for Altman himself. By the early 1980s, the new Hollywood titan was being systematically pushed out of the industry by a new class of corporate yuppie executives who viewed his improvisational anti-authoritarian style as a liability rather than an asset. When the Schwabs cancelled Gramps' retirement insurance, it mirrors the way the studio system was effectively cancelling Altman's creative insurance. O.C. and Stiggs' relentless, often cruel pranks on the Schwabs can thus serve as a metaphor for Altman's distaste for his Schwabs, the studio suits. Altman saturates the film with his own intertextual language. A radio presenter provides a background drone reminiscent of Nashville, and a mention of the candidate Hal Philip Walker confirms the boys inhabit the same cynical political reality as Altman's 70s masterpieces. The score interpolates Henry Mancini's Pink Panther theme, framing their delinquency as slapstick heist. Perhaps most pointedly, Altman cast Dennis Hopper as a paranoid Vietnam veteran with a camera, a clear satire of his Apocalypse Now persona, mocking the self-importance of prestige New Hollywood from within a lowbrow 1980s comedy. The motivation for the boys' chaos is explicitly economic. The Schwab family's insurance company cancelled O.C.'s grandfather's retirement insurance. This transforms their delinquency into class warfare. The Schwabs represent the hollow perfection of the Reagan era, exemplified by the mother who conceals her alcoholism in objects such as binoculars, oven mitts, and ice cream cones. It is a visual metaphor for the rot beneath the suburban facade. O.C. and Stiggs are not just pranksters. They are the young acolytes of a fading era, fighting a scorched earth war to defend a grandfather and a director whom the 1980s were all too eager to leave behind. The film's sexual politics are particularly jarring by modern standards and reveal the mean-spirited streak common in the National Lampoon's brand of nihilism. The protagonist's relationship with the system at times manifests as targeted homophobia. O.C. and Stiggs's antagonism towards the teachers Mr. Sloan and Mr. Granger, who are lovers, seems particularly mean-spirited and unnecessary. This hostility culminates in the film's climax. As the boys finally exact their revenge on Randall Schwab, they eject him from a helicopter onto a beach, punctuated by calling him a faggot. In this moment, the scrappy survivalists of the 1970s lose their countercultural sheen. Their rebellion isn't a progressive strike against Reaganite values. By having his heroes use such language, Altman arguably succeeds in making them unmarketable, but he also blurs the line between mocking the 1980s and participating in a toxic impulse that was not uncommon for its time. Altman's cynicism regarding the 1980s isn't just about the people. It's about the erasure of regional identity in favor of a monolithic, corporate Americanness. This is captured brilliantly in the exchange between O.C.'s parents. When asked if there are cactuses in Arkansas, his father replies, "Arkansas is one of the United States. All America is the same." This line reflects a grim reality of the Reagan era, the rise of the anywhere landscape. Whether it's the sun-bleached sprawl of Arizona or the greenery of Arkansas, the strip malls, the politics, and the social hierarchies remain identical. By claiming all America is the same, Altman suggests that there is no escape for the characters like O.C. and Stiggs. They aren't just rebelling against their neighbors, they're rebelling against a standardized national consciousness. In Altman's earlier westerns, like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, the landscape was a character. By O.C. and Stiggs, the landscape has been paved over by a united state of mind. The cactuses don't matter because the culture and the paranoia that fuels the Schwab bunker is a universal constant. By the time Robert Altman set his sights on the teen comedy genre, his filmography had already served as a sustained deconstruction of the American myth. In the 1970s, he dismantled the military in MASH, the frontier in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and the Hollywood dream in The Long Goodbye. His work was consistently underpinned by a deep skepticism of institutions and a fascination with the outlier, the misfit navigating a broken system. In the mid-1980s, the system had shifted from the battlefield to the suburban cul-de-sac. O.C. and Stiggs represents Altman's aggressive reaction to Reaganism, where the counterculture rebellion of the 1970s had been replaced by a shiny corporate pursuit of wealth and traditional values. The vibrant polyrhythmic textures of African beats serve as a sonic invasion of the white suburban landscape. The tragic history of the film's release confirms Altman's status as a threat to the corporately consolidated hegemony of the 1980s. The most potent symbol of this critique is the high-tech bunker that the Schwabs install in their home, a direct reflection of Reagan-era Cold War paranoia and the Star Wars mentality. The bunker represents the irony of the 1980s. The more wealth one acquired, the more terrified one became of the outside. Altman uses the bunker to show the quest for total security results in total isolation. The Schwabs are effectively locked inside a reinforced cage of their own making. The introduction of the Sponson character, Dennis Hopper playing a drug-dealing Vietnam vet, serves as the film's most haunting philosophical beat. When he hands Stiggs a grenade, and Stiggs realizes that the grenade is live, Hopper's reply that everything gets to be real sooner or later acts as a grim prophecy. Having a 60s countercultural icon pass a weapon to an 80s teenager is a literal passing of the torch. It suggests that the peace and love rebellion of the 1960s has curdled into the live grenade nihilism of the 1980s. Hopper's realness is the arrival of the consequences, war, trauma, and systemic rot that the Schwabs are trying to hide from it in their bunker. In the movie's climax, the boys sabotage a local amateur production of the play Cactus Flower to make room for King Sunny Ade and his African beats. By replacing a stale, safe, bourgeois romantic comedy with a Nigerian juju music, Altman performs an act of cultural decolonization. This fascination with the foreign culture is emblematic of O.C. and Stiggs' status as outsiders, the Gabon flag becoming a symbol of this status. The vibrant polyrhythmic textures of African beats serve as a sonic invasion of the white suburban landscape. It's a moment where Altman's artistic sensibility and the boys' anarchic spirit merge to drown out the sterile, white noise of a middle-class America. While the Schwab family views the world through their lens of the Star Wars defense system, their most frequent victim is already within their gates, Frankie Tang. Frankie, the fiancé of Lenore Schwab and a business associate of Randall Schwab, serves as a narrative punching bag, a domestic outsider who is constantly subjected to the casual, blistering racism of the Schwab patriarch. "Go inside and take your punching bag with you," Randall Schwab says. Just as the boys sabotage the safe production of Cactus Flower, Frankie represents a safe version of the other that the Schwabs have attempted to assimilate. However, because he refuses to fight back for most of the film, he highlights the cowardice of the suburban elite. He is the quiet reality of the invasion they fear, a hard-working, successful man who they must constantly put down in order to maintain their sense of racial and class superiority. This perceived cowardice is subverted, however, when Sponson asks the occupants of the Schwab nest to take him to their commanding officer, and Frankie Tang is more than happy to turn his back on the Schwab family. "I always saw Sponson and Frankie as being on the same side," actor Victor Ho says. The film uses the character of Frankie Tang to expose the rotting core of the Schwab's suburban politeness. Despite his status as Lenore's fiancé, he is treated with a mixture of suspicion and outright bigotry. Randall Schwab Sr. dismisses Frankie's humanity by referring to him as Confucius and chop suey, while Lenore's visible disgust when Frankie kisses her reveals that the Schwab nest is built on a foundation of racial purity. Their desire for a protected space isn't just about safety, it's about the exclusion of anyone who does not fit their narrow, white, affluent mold. While Randall Schwab represents the stiff, paranoid guard of corporate America, the character of Pat Coletti, played by Martin Mull, offers a far more disturbing reflection of the boy's potential future. Coletti is a wealthy businessman who maintains a veneer of cool detachment, yet he explicitly reveals that his leisure is funded by a sweatshop in El Salvador. This connection creates a cynical foreshadowing for O.C. and Stiggs. It suggests that their brand of anarchic, project-based disruption might simply be the larval stage of a Coletti-style tycoon. In the world Altman is dissecting, the predatory brilliance required to dismantle a suburban wedding is the same brilliance eventually channeled into global exploitation. Coletti is the evolved rebel who has successfully outsourced his amorality, proving that in the 1980s, the only thing more profitable than the system is knowing how to game it from the outside. The parallel between the boys and Coletti is most visible in their shared rejection of Scottsdale's sterile aesthetic in favor of manufactured exotic worlds. Just as Osi and Stiggs seek a metaphorical Shangri-La in Gabon, Coletti has transformed his home into a Tahitian shrine. Both parties recognize that Scottsdale is a cultural desert, yet their solutions are equally artificial. While the boys reach for a telephone line connection to an African presidency, Coletti uses his sweatshop capital to build a tropical fantasy within his own walls. These shrines act as a commentary on the 1980s inability to engage with the real world, whether it's a teenager's dream of Gabon or a businessman's private Tahiti. The goal is to build a high-concept exit ramp away from a country where everything is the same. For the Schwabs, next door to Coletti, life is lived within a hyper-guarded Schwab nest, a name that implies a biological imperative to keep the other out. Within the sanctuary, human value is measured exclusively in dollars. This is encapsulated in a chilling beat of fatherly affection, where, upon being asked how she looks, Randall Schwab tells his daughter she looks, quote, expensive. The smirk of approval that follows suggests that, in the Schwab's worldview, beauty is not an aesthetic quality, but a transactional one. This obsession with high-status signifiers is further evidenced by a recurring lobster motif, the lobsters being a symbol of the decadent nouveau riche hunger for social esteem that permeates their every meal. The boys' primary mode of transportation, a custom monstrosity dubbed the Gila monster, serves as a direct visual assault on the aesthetic of the decade. While 1980s cinema was obsessed with the sleek, aspirational curves of the Ferrari or the Porsche, Osi and Stiggs traverse Scottsdale in a vehicle that is intentionally hideous and chaotic. Financed by selling stamps stolen from Randall Schwab Jr., the car represents a literal redistribution of Schwab wealth used to fund an anti-status symbol. It is a loud, rattling rejection of the corporatized image of the American teenager, replacing the high-gloss finish of the era with a do-it-yourself aesthetic of ugly rebellion. The psychological toll of suburban performance is best seen in Stiggs's mother and her commitment to the amateur production of cactus flower. Her immersion in the role borders on the pathological. She litters the house with cactus flowers and crafts desserts in their likeness, even going as far as to get cactus tattoos. By the time the play approaches, her body is covered with scratches from her own props. This desperation for meaning is mirrored in Osi and Stiggs's accomplice, Barney's mother, whose license plate, which reads, "Call me," acts as a silent, desperate scream for connection in a world defined by transactional relationships. Perhaps the darkest thematic shift occurs with the death of Wino Bob. One can read this as a representation of the death of the scrappy survivalist archetype, the old-school American folk hero. His final dismissal of the past, enough of this folklore Uncle Remus bullshit, suggests that the romanticized myths of American grit are dead, replaced by a colder, more nihilistic reality. Ultimately, it's not hard to imagine why Osi and Stiggs was such a definitive commercial failure. It occupied a cultural no man's land. It wasn't titillating or earnest enough for the mainstream audience. and the devoted Altman cinema-goer had little interest in seeing a twisted version of the National Lampoon comedy. Altman's signature style, his preference for sonic clutter, ensemble chaos, and moral ambiguity, was too idiosyncratic for the mid-1980s, a decade defined by corporately consolidated hegemony. Unlike contemporaries such as Tim Burton, whose eccentricities eventually aligned with a bankable outsider aesthetic, Altman's vision was too prickly and deconstructive for the Reagan era. This disconnect would cast him into a professional wilderness. He would not see another major success until The Player in 1992. There is a great density in the imagery and overlapping soundscape of the movie, and it's understandable that audiences may have been confused upon initial viewing. Robert Altman coming to the same conclusion. Many of my films, I feel you're not going to get them unless you see them twice, he explains. See it a second time, you're not freaked out by the plot. You're able to deal with the corners of the frame, with the nuances. But you can't ask the vast-paying public to see a film twice, so it's a dilemma. Do I worry that the people are only going to see it once? Or do I go my way and think about the 25 people who might see it again and say, hey, that was really good? O.C. and Stiggs was about how two teenage boys spend their summer, and it was also about cultural anarchy. Teenage exploitation films were all the rage at the time. I agreed to do it because I hated teenage movies so much. I thought I could do it as a satire of the teenage movie, but of course it was sold as a teenage movie. It was a suspect project from the beginning. However, the film's failure in 1987 is precisely what makes it a fascinating artifact today. With its absurdist non sequitur rhythm and its stubborn refusal to provide a comforting moral center, O.C. and Stiggs exists as both a 1980s relic and a forerunner to Adult Swim and television shows such as Beavis and Butthead. Its anti-comedy DNA, where the joke is often the awkwardness or the cruelty itself, found its true audience a few decades later in the 21st century. In the end, Altman didn't fail to make a teen movie. He succeeded in making a film about the death of the American dream, disguised as a prank that the audience wasn't quite ready to be the butt of.